Samarkand and the Caspian Sea were bred those great horses which carried Alexander the Great into India, the Romans to the outer edges of the known world, saved the Chinese Empire from invading barbarians, carried the Islamic faith to the far edges of Asia, and enabled the conquistadores to open up the Americas. Originally, the appearance of men on horseback terrified the Greeks. They believed that these centaurs, half man, half horse, were extraterrestrial beings in precisely the same way that the American Indians were to fear the Spanish conquistadores. But in the 7th century of the pre-Christian era, the Greeks embraced the horse as a symbol of excellence. And it was as a symbol that the horse played his most effective role in the Trojan Wars. At the classical Greek Olympics, chariot racing became the blue ribbon amongst all the sports, and the winners the ideal of heroic achievement. Of the horse developed into a desire to understand and to be as one with the horse.
Greek horse masters such as Xenophon in the 4th century BC were the first to treat horsemanship in an art form. An empathy became apparent between horse and man. In fact, Xenophon said that nothing forced is ever beautiful. And also, he said, that the horses should be asked to do what they themselves delight in.
The Greeks' relaxed approach to horsemanship is well illustrated in this frieze from the Parthenon, and is in direct contrast to the militaristic stiffness of these Assyrian warriors. The Greeks' ideal horse was similar to an Anglo-Arab. Standing some 14 hands high, it was horses like this which spearheaded the spread of Greek culture and art throughout the Near East and into India. The Greek tactics, developed by Xenophon, proved decisive in battle, culminating in Alexander the Great's defeat of Darius, the Persian king of kings, at the Battle of Issus, where the Persians lost 110,000 men and the Greeks 450. made available to the Greeks the large Nicaean horse from the grasslands of northwest Persia. Crossed with the hot-blooded horses of the Greek armies, a larger, quality horse could now be produced.
This infusion of new blood, this new generating blood, must have come from the Arabian horse, which, without much doubt, is the fountainhead of all the horse breeds of the world. It may indeed be that there was an element of Arab blood already in the Nicaean horse.
By 327, Alexander had entered India, where, in his defeat of King Porus in the Battle of Hydaspes, his charger Bucephalus was mortally wounded. Bucephalus may be seen as the first in a long line of cavalry chargers who became immortalized as the partners of their illustrious riders. It was related by Plutarch how, having bought Bucephalus for a figure near to £10,000 at modern values, Philip of Macedon found him unrideable. Challenged by his 12-year-old son's claim that he could master the horse, Philip bet Alexander the purchase price of the horse that he too would fall victim to Bucephalus's fiery temperament. Noticing that this highly strung horse was upset by his own shadow, Alexander turned him into the sun and, to the amazement of all present, soon had Bucephalus trotting calmly round the courtyard. Giving his son the horse, Philip, duly impressed, said, "You must seek out a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is not broad enough for you." Bucephalus was reputedly well over 30 years old when he died, and had carried Alexander in all his victorious battles. Distraught by his loss, Alexander ordered that Bucephalus should be buried with full military honors. Just as Alexander had ridden into India on the back of Bucephalus, some 300 years later, Prince Siddhartha was to ride out of it on his stallion Kanthaka to seek the supreme beatitude. Reflecting the respect shown by Alexander towards Bucephalus, the prince, who was to become the Buddha, echoed this respect for the horse when he called upon Kanthaka to lend me your strength and your speed. The world's salvation and your own is at stake. Alexander's dream of uniting Europe and Asia did not long survive his death in 323 BC. But the intermarriages of Greeks and Persians ensured that Greek philosophy and learning remained and flourished throughout the area of conquest. On land, the horse remained of supreme importance, chariots and cavalry being seen as the essence of power. But his place in Western military thought was now temporarily eclipsed by the naval struggle, which developed between the rising martial powers for control of the Mediterranean. Eastern Europe, however, succeeding tribes of nomadic warriors continuously threatened the frontiers of the civilized world.
To the north of these mountains of the Great Caucasus Range lay the trails of the nomadic peoples, trails dating back to the Scythian era in the 6th and 7th centuries BC, and existing right up until the late Middle Ages, a time span during which Scythians, Sarmatians, Alans, Tartar-Mongols, and Polotvians had moved all over this steppe land. Now in the Elekunovka Valley, in the very foothills of Mount Elbrus. And from the beginning of the first millennium AD, the routes along which the steppe peoples traveled to reach the mountains passed by here. In this very place, above the ice-cold cascades, is a network of 5 fortresses. Nomadic horse people, 3,000 years ago, lived in a similar way to the people of the steppes today. In each of their fortresses, there would have been lookout towers within visible distance of each other. Such was this visual link that if an enemy appeared from the steppe, a signal could be transmitted all along the Black Sea coast of the Caucasus, warning of an attack. Especially since this is a section of the Great Silk Road which led along these very foothills of the Caucasus.
What sort of people were these nomadic invaders? Invaders who were, after all, our own ancestors. Some idea of their sophistication is revealed by the effects found in the burial grounds in the Altai Mountains.
We are standing at the place of interment of a distinguished Scythian lady of about the 4th century BC, and we see in front of us a magnificent relic of Scythian art, an art which could not have been created if its creators had not been horsemen and nomads, people who had introduced horsemanship to the countries of the Middle East and the Caucasus, and whose culture in return was enriched by the cultural tradition of the Caucasus. Here we see what is surely one of the most magnificent works of Scythian art, indeed of art of antiquity, to be found in any museum in the Soviet Union. Dating from the 4th century BC, it depicts the culture of nomads and horsemen. On the pictograms are depicted mythological scenes. Different scholars have interpreted them in different ways, but it seems most likely that the upper frieze represents various mythological notions of the ancient Scythians, possibly connected with cults and sacrificial rites. Then the order in which the animals are depicted on the frieze, the horses first, followed by the long-horned cattle, and then the sheep, indicated that these animals could all be used interchangeably for sacrificial purposes, and that animal sacrifice had replaced human sacrifice. The lower frieze depicts a scene of torment, a feature very frequently encountered in Scythian art, and indeed probably its most characteristic trait. This rug was used to decorate a wall in a chamber of the Pozrik burial mound, and an examination of the friezes on it yields much of interest. We see an excellent portrayal of the Akhaltiki horse of about the 5th century BC, The rug was made locally using applique on felt and depicts the bewitching of a horse, or rather of a rider, appearing before a goddess who is pictured seated with the staff of life in her hands. Moreover, we can see on the rug all the distinguishing features of the horses. We may now examine the harnesses further, which are exhibited in other parts of the museum. Now here, we see riding equipment dating from the 5th to 6th centuries BC and found in the Posric burial mounds. This equipment was designed for use on a riding horse, and from it we can trace the whole history of the development of riding equipment right up to the present times. On the horse's head is a mask of a stag, because the deer had been a domesticated animal for a long time before that. This riding equipment is that of a steppe horseman, and its history goes back over 2,000 years and perhaps even further. The saddle is soft with no stirrups and is of wooden construction. All this was for the Akaltiki, a magnificent riding horse, powerful, swift, the horse upon which a departing Altai leader should enter the kingdom which lies beyond the grave.
By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Scythians, whose military tactics had inspired the formation of the Greek cavalry, were being overrun by the Sarmatians, who were the first warriors to use body and horse armor and develop a wooden saddle tree.
A tree is the foundation upon which a saddle is built. And because of that invention, people like the Sarmatians, for instance, who had taken over the Scythians and were going to become Goths in time, they were able to alter the role of the mounted soldier. Now this is in fact a modern American Western saddle, but in shape it would have been a little like those early Sarmatian saddles. And just look what happens when you have a saddle that gives you this sort of support. There were no stirrups, mind you, but here you sit, imprisoned as it were, between this high cantle at the back and this support at the front. Now instead of shooting an arrow at your enemy, turning and galloping away, now you can take a lance, and for the first time we see the Sarmatians using the lance couched under the arm here. Before, they could only throw a javelin or stab. Now they could close with the enemy and expect to stay in the saddle. But of course, they still hadn't got the ultimate security, which was the stirrup. We don't know where it came from. There's a body of opinion that says that it came out of China, and we know very well that Attila and his Huns used it. My own theory is that it came probably from the tow rope used on the plains of India. And when you took that tow rope, which you put your big toe in, up to Mongolia, then you needed to wear a big felt boot, and from that developed a bigger tow rope, and then a wooden frame, and then at last a metal frame, which gave the rider the stirrup and that much more security in the saddle.
The uneasy truce which had existed for some 200 years between the nomadic peoples of the northwest of China and the Chinese now erupted into open warfare. Becoming Zhou Emperor at the age of 16, Wu Di, believing absolutely in his celestial ancestry, determined to be rid of the degrading need to pay off the mounted warriors beyond the Great Wall.
China's martial emperor, Wu Di, decided to put an end to a policy of appeasement that his predecessors had been following as regards the Xiongnu. He decided that he would deal with his problem not by bribes, but by direct force. He therefore devoted the resources of the empire to organizing great armies, in which cavalry formed the major component, in order to meet these nomads on their own territory.
To improve the quality of his cavalry, Wu Di sought to import the ancestors of these horses, the golden horses of Samarkand. After his envoys had been repeatedly turned down, imprisoned, and ultimately executed by Yu Ji, the king of Bactria, the emperor sent an invading army 3,000 miles along the Silk Road, determined to seize these descendants of Alexander's Greek horses. The initial expedition ended in disaster, but 2 years later the Chinese succeeded in bringing back 30 of these purebred heavenly horses, together with some half-bred mares and stallions. And it was upon this foundation stock that the improvement in Wu Di's cavalry was based.
He sent a succession of campaigns across the Great Wall to pursue the Xiongnu. However, the Xiongnu, as nomads, were able to withdraw and to live off the land in a way that the Chinese armies could not. As a result, Wu Di nearly brought his empire to bankruptcy. Finally, at the end of his life, he regretted this policy that he had followed, and the Chinese court reverted to subtle diplomacy and also the maintenance of effective frontier defenses.
The power of Wu Di's armies had greatly expanded the Chinese empire. This did not, however, reduce the constant fear felt by succeeding Chinese dynasties of invasion by the mounted warriors along their northwestern frontier. This obsession led to the neglect of their defenses elsewhere, so that European adventurers, many centuries ahead, were easily able to penetrate their eastern seaboard. The importance of the horse in the history of man is nowhere better illustrated than in the ultimate result of Wu Di's invasion of Bactria. By forcing the Huns westward into Europe, the Chinese cavalry was to make a major contribution to the fall of the Roman Empire and to the onset of the Dark Ages. In peaceful terms, however, the Chinese powers of invention produced the horse collar and also many significant advances in the design of the harness, designs which have survived to the present day. Amongst these illustrations of Han horse-drawn transport can be seen some of the developments and improvements that have been made. The breast strap, seen here passing across the chest of the horse, cured the problem of putting pressure on the horse's windpipe. Breeching, which attached the horse's harness to the shafts, enabled the horse to be used as a brake without the cart running into his hind quarters. It also enabled carts and carriages to be backed for the first time. Most important of all was the horse collar. Believed to have been developed from the collars worn by Chinese slaves, or coolies, to drag ships up the Yangtze River, this collar enabled the full power of the horse to come into play, efficiently and effectively. A surprising and lasting byproduct of the conflict between Chinese and nomad was the effect which it had on Chinese clothes. To ride effectively in battle, the Chinese were forced to replace their traditional flowing robes with jackets and trousers. These cavalrymen's clothes are virtually identical to the clothes worn in China today.
Ever realized just how much the horse has influenced us in what we wear? I mean, you may think that these well-turned-out riders are a race apart, but I can assure you, you're wrong. These riders, wearing riding boots of classical design, wonderful high shiny black, are still available in the high street. And both of them had silk stocks on, which are lovely silk kerchiefs tied around their necks, which they used to use in the old days, just in case they were going to break their necks, or they could use it as a bandage, or as stirrup leather. And now, people wear them in the evenings as a decorative thing for evening wear, without even having seen a horse at all. I'm wearing a black jacket with great, big, broad, wide shoulders, a nipped-in waist, reminiscent of a lady's riding habit from many years ago, great big balloon skirt so I can leap onto my horse and take off at a moment's notice, and I'm wearing a hat to keep the shade on my face, a ribbon around the side, a rosette for first prize, needless to say,
Well, maybe this is a bit grand for some of us, but look at these riders. They're wearing what we all wear. Take jeans. They were made expressly for the American cowboy in the early 1800s. The tough jean material would stand being stretched over a saddle for days on end. Now, everybody wears jeans. And talking of trousers, why do you think they were invented in the first place? More than 2,000 years ago, the horsemen of the steppes were almost certainly the first people to wear them. If you wear robes astride a horse, they ride up and your legs get freezing. In trousers, they just don't. When the English and the Americans took up polo, the polo neck evolved. And in hotter climes, such as India, the English polo players started the idea of what we now know today as the T-shirt. So you can see how we've been influenced by the horse ever since we first met him, I think, and how I think he's going to keep on influencing us forever almost, simply because of the wonderful romance and the excitement of the beast.
In the West, the major theatre of war had been for over 100 years centred on and around the Mediterranean. With the defeat of Carthage, the Romans were able to expand their empire into Central and Northern Europe. This expansion created a need to extend and maintain lines of communication over land and led to a growing dependence upon the horse. Unlike the Greeks or the Persians, the Romans were not outstanding horsemen, but they were outstanding horse breeders, and their practical nature led them to be the first people to breed a variety of different types of horse for a variety of different purposes. The many different environments encompassed by their far-flung empire enabled the Romans to cross-breed from a wide selection of contrasting native types. The venaticus, or hunter type of horse, suitable for hawking or the pursuit of wild game, would originally have come from Phoenicia. To add quality to their strength, an infusion of Arab blood, as seen in the horses from Compine, was made. The expansion of the Roman Empire, following the final defeat of Carthage, opened up the Iberian Peninsula to an infusion of hot blood from the Barbs of North Africa. These descendants of the horses brought by the Hyksos invaders into Egypt some 1,500 years earlier, when crossed with the native Iberian ponies, produced a high-quality horse. When crossed with the much heavier cold-blooded descendants of the forest horses of northern Europe, this new breed produced a Cantharius, a parade or sporting horse. Further crossbreeding produced the Itinerarius, or short-haul draft horse, which was used to move heavy goods over limited distances. The Manuus, or small driving horse, was developed for local transport purposes. For travelling long distances, the ambulator, or walking horse, was used.
In the modern horse world, we recognize 4 natural paces in the horse. The walk, the trot, in which the horse moves diagonal pairs of legs, the canter, and the gallop. But there is a 5th natural pace, and that is called pacing, or by the older word, ambling. Now, the pacing horse moves lateral pairs of legs like that, and it gives the back a great stillness on which you can sit in perfect comfort while the horse goes away at really a very fast pace. The ancient horsemen knew a lot about pacing because they prized these sort of horses for their comfort, and we know that there are strains of horses that pace naturally rather than trotting with diagonal pairs of legs. You get the Arcotiki and the Turkmen, and in America itself you have those plantation horses like the Tennessee Walker, the Missouri Foxtrotter, which the plantation owners used as comfortable mounts to oversee their plantations.
The one-sided gait, which is extremely economical, is reminiscent of the present-day North American pacer.
That's certainly the first time I've ridden a pacer. You can probably see it looks a little bit unsure. However, before the Romans had discovered the stirrup, or indeed invented their own wooden frame saddles, they were riding without anything to keep them in place. And they discovered that the safest, securest, and most comfortable place was somewhere rather different to where I am now. If you just hang on a minute, and I'll show you. They got their backsides right back here. Whoa. Whoa, lad. And their legs right forward. And they gripped their calves and their heels. And away they went, rather them than I.
To protect their horses' feet from the hard surfaces of their roads, the Romans developed this hippo sandal. In the northern parts of their empire, however, the damp climate forced them to adopt a more efficient form of shoe, which would not be sucked off in the heavy going. Horseshoeing was a very ancient craft, first practiced by the Celts and Gauls over 2,000 years ago. The Celts and the Gauls arrived in Britain about 450 BC, and as Iron Age people, they were experienced in working in iron, and soon found a way of nailing a shoe to a horse's foot. In Britain and Northern Europe, the climate is very wet, and the foot of a horse absorbs quite a lot of moisture. As they rode and worked their horses, the protective covering wore away and exposed the sensitive part of the foot. And this is the type of early shoe they would have used. From the fact that they were never more than about 4.5 inches across, we can gather the horses at that time were quite small. By the Middle Ages, they were using this type of shoe, rather saucer-shaped. And then they began to turn the heels up to provide a better grip. The whole weight of the horse is carried on the wall of the hoofs, which, if not protected, wears down rapidly on hard surfaces. The shoe is fitted exactly to the shape of the foot and becomes an extension to the wall so that it doesn't upset the balance. The nails must go into the wall of the hoof, the outer edge of the foot, which, like the tips of our own fingers and toenails, has no feeling, so the horse suffers no pain whatsoever. The Roman love of sport and spectacle was fulfilled to a large degree in their great amphitheaters or circuses. Here, skilled acts of horsemanship found a ready response in audiences of up to 300,000. Chariot racing drew vast crowds and enabled the volatile Roman populace to give vent to their feelings of joy or frustration. Betting became a major pastime, with carrier pigeons being released to carry the latest results to off-course punters. Successful charioteers were the great stars of the age and earned vast fortunes. But the fame of their horses was even greater. Marshall, one of the greatest charioteers of his time, wrote of his horse Andromeda, "Yes, I am renowned throughout the world, but why so much envy? I'll never be more famous than Andromeda." The care and efficiency of the Roman breeding program was producing quality horses, well able to respond to all the various demands made upon them. For the Romans, there were the same criteria in a horse's conformation which we look for today.
I'm going to just do a little bit of explaining about one or two things that are very important to the horse, namely his limbs. If he hasn't got really well-formed, good, strong limbs, the job he's going to do in life is going to be that bit more difficult to him. You maybe often hear about people talking about a horse having good bone. It's a little bit misleading, this expression, but we're talking about this area from here to here. And we're talking about wanting to see a good, square, chunky-looking bit of bone. And if I have to criticize Annan Hill, he's a little bit light of bone here, maybe. And about the only other criticism I have of him is this pastern joint here. It's a little too upright. It could just be a little more slanting. And by being upright, it'll mean that he'll send quite a bit of jar when he gallops and jumps through the bits that probably matter most, which is the tendon running back down the back of the bone, and the ankle joint here, which we call the fetlock. Following him on back to probably the most important end, which is the engine end, he's got what we call a lovely hind leg. I would be looking specifically for the length from the hip bone to the hock, the width across the second thigh here, which wants to be wide, and that length wants to be long. These two things are there. You've got probably a horse that can gallop and that can jump. If we just turn his backside full on, I can show you one other thing that I always look for in a horse. Personally, I like to see a bit of width between the hip bones, and a rather square look. If looking from behind, the horse comes square down there and square across here. So there's rather a box-like formation at the back and wide apart here. Will often imply there's a lot of strength and power in the back end for galloping, but particularly for jumping. And from there we move on to the shoulder, which in his case is a lovely slanting one, which will make him gallop much more comfortably. And out of the shoulder grows, in his case, the most lovely neck with a beautiful crest. Often you find horses with what we call a U-neck, when literally it dips in the opposite way to what it is now, which is a pretty unbalancing feature for a horse to have. And at the end of that neck, an almost perfect head, with the most important bit of all, the eye. This tells the story. If the horse is generous and genuine, you can almost always see it in the eye. If he's mean and nasty, the eye will tell you. And make no mistake, you can't make a horse do what he doesn't want to do. So if the eye's with you and his temperament's with you, you've got a chance.
The emphasis on temperament, on the horse's willingness to cooperate, increases in importance when the rider is asking for speed and precision, boldness and rapid responses. The particular abilities required of a modern show jumper must have been similar to those looked for by Roman charioteers. Although the Romans' use of the horse was strictly practical, their view of themselves upon the horse was romantic. It was how they appeared as riders that mattered to the Romans. The more fiery the horse, the more fiery the man. Describing such a horse, the poet Virgil wrote, "If from afar the clash of arms be heard, he knows not how to stand still. His ears prick up, his limbs quiver, and snorting, he rolls the collected fire under his nostrils." The Roman dislike of using cavalry did not initially inhibit their success on the battlefield. Fighting against militarily unsophisticated barbarian forces, or indeed against other Roman armies, in the endless succession of civil wars within the empire, the excellence and discipline of the Roman heavy infantry disguised the weakness inherent in not developing a cavalry arm. Their crushing defeat by Hannibal's Numidian cavalry at Cannae in 216 BC, nor the rout of Crassus's legions by the Parthian horsemen at Carrhae, 163 years later, seem to have affected any change in Roman military attitude. Eventually, increasing pressure from mounted nomadic warriors from the ancient steppes forced the Romans to recognize the effectiveness of cavalry. Goths and Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Alans, Burgundians and Suevi moved westward into Europe to threaten the northern boundaries of the empire. The Romans at last realized that soldiers on foot lacking cavalry support were always at risk when attacked by mounted warriors. The warriors from the steppes were not only marvelous horsemen, but also were conscious of the need to care for their horses. Their appreciation of their partners in war was reflected in their ornaments and artifacts, which portrayed the horse in almost godlike terms. This point is amplified by this bowl, found in a grove in Gori, Georgia. This golden horse is a deity in equine form, to whom an altar was erected. In similar vein, the portrayal of a horse on this belt buckle. This second bowl portrays perhaps the greatest of the steppes horses, the Akhal-Tiki. Rather than risk wounding or even killing 10 of these horses, the Chinese lifted the siege on a steppeland town. Horses were seen not only as deities, but also as partners in heroic deeds. These subjects are taken straight from the legends which depict gods, heroes and kings always on horseback. By the beginning of the 2nd century AD, the empire had reached the limits of its conquests. The Emperor Hadrian, to consolidate these frontiers, developed the use of local native cavalry. Foremost among these were the Numidians, who'd served Hannibal so well in his defeats of the Romans over 300 years earlier, and the Mauritanians, who'd served with Caesar. Both these North African tribes benefited from the Roman skill in producing quality cavalry horses, which were available in large numbers in nearby Iberia. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius was forced to rely on a mixture of Syrian, Bedouin, and Etrurian mercenaries to contain the Persians in the east, while in northern Italy he hired Goth cavalry to withstand the increasing number of barbarian invaders. Years after the death of Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor Severus made a determined attempt to build up and reorganize the Roman cavalry. Equipping them with arms and armor copied from Rome's longtime enemies, the Persians, he divided his cavalry into light cavalry, or cataphracti, and heavy cavalry, or clibanarii, who can be seen as the original forerunners of the Frankish knights who emerged 5 centuries later. In spite of the initial successes achieved by Severus, this development died with the emperor when he was murdered by his own troops while campaigning in Germany. Even had the Romans continued to develop their cavalry, it probably would have been too late to prevent their steady decline. Constant wars, civil strife, corruption, and internecine struggles for power all contributed to the worsening of the empire's finances. Divided into 2 administrative and defensive areas of east and west by Diocletian in AD 292, Rome became ever more isolated. This process of isolation was greatly increased by the first Christian emperor, Constantine, when he decided to build his capital, Constantinople, in Byzantium, the eastern part of the empire, rather than base himself in Rome. Although the horse continued to play a major role in commerce, sport, communications, and travel, the cost of maintaining and training cavalry was seen by the Romans to be too expensive. History is littered by the reluctance of affluent societies to temper that affluence to the needs to defend it. And for the Romans, this was to prove a fatal mistake. Driven out of Asia and into Eastern Europe came the Huns, the descendants of the Xiongnu Mongolian warriors. The Chinese had said of the Xiongnu, their country is the back of a horse. Certainly the power of their descendants was entirely due to the horse. Having the advantage of stirrups, the Huns would fire their heavy bows from a steady platform at full gallop, with deadly effect, and wheel, turning as one in squadrons at high speed. Their advance into Eastern Europe forced the Ostrogoths and Visigoths westward, increasing the pressure on the Roman Empire. Learning their cavalry tactics from the Huns, these Goths, with the help of Hun mercenaries, destroyed the Roman infantry at Adrianople and captured their Emperor Valens in 378 AD, ending forever the myth of Roman military invincibility. 40 years later, the sacking of Rome by Alaric's Goths signaled the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire.
So often in history, it seems to be the horse that has enabled man to follow his basest instincts. Certainly in the overthrow of the Roman Empire in the West, the Persian Empire in the Middle East, and the Shang and Zhou dynasties in China. Nevertheless, in these same areas, the use of the horse was fundamental to many of the cultural and economic advances that have been made.
In North America, however, where the horse had been extinct for over 5,000 years, the scattered inhabitants continued to live as nomadic hunters, with little or no change in their lifestyle from that of their Ice Age ancestors.
One of the problems that the nomads of North American plains faced was transportation. Out in the grassland plains, there weren't always rivers for them to have goods and things like that to boat up and down in canoes or different boats. So they were relatively limited in what they could move. When they had to move their camps and so forth, they had to carry everything with them. That's one of the reasons why they didn't make extensive use of pottery or large materials like that, and everything they owned was very light, very portable, very compact, because they had to, before the acquisition of the horse, carry it themselves, either on their backs or on a small travois that was pulled by a dog. That was their largest animal that they had domesticated. So the lack of the horse was a very real factor in the types of material things that the Plains nomad Indians could acquire and could develop.
By enabling man to function more efficiently, the horse enabled man to create more leisure, and leisure is essential if the arts and sciences and knowledge itself are to flourish.
The collapse of Rome signaled the beginning of the Dark Ages, and as barbarian hordes poured into Central and Western Europe, all organized forms of horse breeding came to an end.
In a few minutes tonight, though the title may lead you to think for a while that it's about a horse and somebody else, it's actually about a father and son, Sorrel and Son, based on a 1925 best-selling novel in England that premieres next after a KQED Northern California spotlight on the AIDS and homeless. Next Sunday on Horses, there'll be a report on horses as war power next Sunday evening at 9 o'clock.